With the release of Fire Emblem Engage, a lot of discussion has started regarding EXP distribution, particularly regarding a lot of the early game units. Welcome to a Fire Emblem talk. Today I want to discuss the topic of EXP as a resource in a little more detail, and what should be considered when choosing who to give your EXP to, and when to pass up on EXP altogether. Before we start, I would like to thank the people who back the channel on Patreon. The support really helps me out a lot and is greatly appreciated. For more information, check the link in the description. Now, before going any further, I just want to clarify that this isn't going to go into specifics regarding who you should invest into or which units you should look to take forward later into the game, but more of the general concept of experience, its value as a resource, and how you can treat it to help make your path through the game easier. This will also be relevant to most games in the series, not just the newest release of Fire Emblem Engage. Experience in Fire Emblem is used to level up your units, raising their stats and in a lot of cases also push them closer towards important level benchmarks, particularly promotions, but also in some cases things like abilities and spells. This obviously makes it extremely important. These advantages that gaining levels through gaining EXP grant you can be hugely impactful in giving you the easiest time beating the game, and so it becomes clear to see why this resource is one that is so crucial to manage correctly. When we talk about EXP being a resource, one aspect of this is very globally understood, and that is the distribution and allocation of that resource. For all the reasons we just mentioned, it is always important to keep that EXP flowing into the units who you plan to use for the long term, or even just for the next few chapters, to ensure they are up to par to compete with the challenges ahead of them. Most players recognise this and will play accordingly, giving kills and the EXP they provide to units they plan on using in the long term where possible. However, there is another aspect to managing your EXP, to using this resource effectively. Of course, like with any resource, ensuring enough of this is being invested for future use is important, but knowing when to sacrifice some EXP to help your current situation is also vital to having an easier path through the game. This can be done by either giving kills to units who you don't plan to use in the future, and thus won't benefit from the EXP the kills provide, or by just simply leaving enemies on the map or disposing of them in ways which don't grant EXP, such as blocking their spawns. I prefer to view this concept as spending EXP, which can feel odd since unlike another resource such as gold, it isn't depleting from an existing pool but simply not being acquired. As a result, rather than feeling like you are trading EXP for an asset or advantage, like we see when you spend gold or any other resource, it can feel like you are missing out on getting the resource at all. But functionally, it's mostly the same. Spending EXP in these ways can simply be used to make the game easier for you, in the same way in which spending gold to upgrade a weapon or buy a new item does. It can also just be used to save time or effort, to just allow you to progress through the chapters faster. For example, if you don't use Seth for the first few chapters of Sacred Stones, it's hardly going to be a terribly difficult affair, but it will take significantly longer than if you do use him, and saving that time and effort by using your Jagan to assist you can absolutely be worth it, even if it does give you less in-game rewards. Making things faster or easier for yourself is a valid use of resources too. This is even more prevalent in games where your Jagan, the strong pre-promote who is with your army from the get-go and is a common feature in the series, may not be a unit who you want to keep around for the long term, because whilst they are strong at the start, they fall off later down the line. This includes units like Jagan himself, FE6's Marcus, or FE17's Vander. Players can be reluctant to use these units, despite their immediate strength in comparison to the rest of your army, because the EXP they gain from combat will have little, if any, impact, whereas if that EXP had gone into another unit, its benefits would have been felt more and for longer. These units also usually gain very little EXP in comparison to your other party members, which further exasperates this, and keeps it present in games like the Blazing Blade, Sacred Stones, and Path of Radiance, where your Jagan has a lot of long-term relevancy. Now, it is worth validating that these concerns do have merit. If you don't give experience to the units you want to use later in the game, they will struggle to keep up. But it's all about balance. Whilst you need to ensure that your long-term units have enough EXP to be able to compete with the challenges ahead of them, they don't need to take all of the available EXP on every map. There is a level of ironic redundancy in refusing to use your strong units now so that you can have strong units later. When you're choosing to distribute or sacrifice EXP, there are a few questions that can be raised. Can you afford to spend the EXP currently? Will there still be opportunities later to get the EXP that your units need? How much easier or more convenient does spending that EXP make your life in the short term? Can spending that EXP actually be beneficial for you all around? Let's go over these in a little more detail. Can you afford to spend the EXP currently? Well, this can often be a difficult question to answer, particularly on a first playthrough where you don't know what's coming up, but there are some things that can help you come to a decision. The most obvious is, are you struggling at the minute? If you are finding that you're having a pretty breezy time of things, you can probably afford to spend the EXP. If a unit you want to use is struggling and could heavily benefit from the help now, that EXP becomes more important to distribute to them. Perhaps the best example of this is Chapter 2 of Fire Emblem Three Houses. Whilst you have plenty of opportunities to spend EXP here, being able to leave many enemies on the map if you wish, and having tangible reason to do so, as it can make the clear much easier at a time when your tools are limited, your power level is low, and your number of divine pulses are very few. However, if you do carefully distribute the EXP, you can have many more units hit level 5 before the end of the chapter, allowing them to promote before Chapter 3, which can be extremely valuable. This is where finding that balance can be both very clear and very impactful. Another thing that can impact this can be promotion items becoming available. Whilst again this often benefits from future knowledge, it can also be used in the moment. For example, if you are on Sacred Stones Chapter 7 and see Murray drops a Knight's Crest and your Franz is level 8, it stands to reason to make sure he gets some EXP on this map to reach level 10, so that he can promote at the end of the chapter, so at least some of that EXP cannot afford to be spent and needs to be used effectively. Will there still be opportunities to get the EXP your units need in the future? Again, this can feel like it's impossible to predict on a blind playthrough. After all, you don't know how hard the game will become, or what will be around the corner. Obviously, this does get much easier on a repeat playthrough, but there are things you can use to guide you here, even on your first time through a game. The easiest way to judge this is by recognizing how many units you have who currently need EXP. Going back to FE 8 as an example, if you are on Chapter 5 and you already plan on using Franz, Vanessa, Arta and Lute, and all of them are still in their training arcs, it's pretty apparent that EXP will be highly contested in the future, and as a result, future opportunities to earn it will become slim for anybody, meaning distributing EXP effectively now becomes a higher priority, and spending it is less viable. Of course, if you do know the game and what's coming up, this question is much easier to answer. For example, in Fire Emblem Engage, if you know you want to use Etie, she will be able to get a solid amount of EXP from the flying enemies in Chapter 7 and 8, so if she misses out on some XP in Chapter 5 or 6, that's likely not going to be too detrimental. That means you can either distribute it elsewhere or spend it on a unit who you just don't plan on using in the long term to make the current map easier. How much easier or more convenient does spending that EXP make your life in the short term? This is a question which is much less dependent on having played the game before, but can still be a tricky one to answer. The easiest example of where this question pops up can be with boss kills, whether that be choosing to kill a boss with a Jagan who has a much easier time with it, rather than a unit who would find the large amount of EXP desirable, or choosing to avoid an optional boss to save yourself the trouble of killing them. Of course, there are a ton of situations where you could choose to just kill enemies with a unit you don't plan to use for ease or convenience, and this is probably the most common factor in deciding between spending and distributing EXP. However, perhaps the most impactful example of this is map skipping. Typically, when you get access to a large amount of movement tools, especially the warp staff, a lot of levels become possible to entirely skip, particularly those which have an objective of just eliminating a boss, by simply warping a powerful unit over to them to wipe them out. This can obviously leave a massive amount of EXP and resources left on the map, but also trivializes a massive amount of these levels, and can also link in very closely with the next point. Can spending that EXP now actually be beneficial for you all around? In a lot of scenarios, sacrificing some EXP by using characters who won't benefit from it long term can actually make it much more likely you will secure advantages in other areas, such as acquiring additional items from villages or from completing side objectives. Perhaps the most obvious example of this would be bonus EXP. In Metelius games, most maps have bonus EXP which can be earned by completing hidden objectives on the map, such as beating the level in a certain number of turns. Bonus EXP can be freely distributed to any units you wish from the menu, so it is highly desirable. Using strong early game units like Titania and to a lesser extent Shinon and Gatri in Path of Radiance can massively increase your chances of earning this bonus EXP. So whilst you may lose out on some EXP on the map itself because it's going to units who don't benefit from it massively, it can help you overall. As mentioned before, this can link in significantly with map skipping, particularly in the case of optional paralog maps. The paralog granted by Lorenz in Fire Emblem Three Houses, Land of the Golden Deer, provides the valuable Thyasus staff when cleared. However, it can be very challenging if done at its earliest opportunity. That is, unless you use the warp spell to throw somebody at the boss, Acheron, and end the map on turn 1. Whilst you would lose a lot of potential EXP from doing this, access to the high-powered reward earlier might well be worth it. You may notice all I did was pose the questions, rather than providing the answers, and that's because almost all of this will be judged on a case-by-case basis by the player, and there isn't some default correct option. These are just some of the things to consider when deciding when it is worth it to sacrifice some EXP rather than giving it to the units you are trying to raise. EXP is one of the most important resources in Fire Emblem, and using it appropriately will always be important, but I also feel it's incredibly common for players to make their path through the games much harder because of over-focusing on the distribution and maximisation of experience. Thank you for watching. If you have anything else you would like to see me discuss, feel free to drop a suggestion in the comments. If you would like to talk about this video, the channel, or Fire Emblem in general more, consider joining the Discord. I would also like to once again thank the people who back the channel on Patreon for their support. If you too would like to pledge, there is a link in the description which also contains more information about the benefits to supporting. Thank you all again for watching.